Hi everyone, sorry I haven't recorded a video in a while again. I've been meaning to record this particular video for a few weeks now and just never got around to it. Okay, so I wanted to walk you through an app that I built a few weeks ago, which is a REST API endpoint tester for the browser. And this is a tool that I built a few weeks ago using React with Node and Express on the back end. So I'm just going to quickly run through how the tool works and then also kind of what the code looks like as well. So before I start, I just want to say this is called Papyrus. I haven't spelled it wrongly. I just wanted to include API because I'm a really big fan of puns. So that pleased me quite a lot that I could find a name that had API in it. Okay, so the idea of this is to test a RESTful API that I built on my server side. What a REST API is where you can hit the same route, the same URL, but use different methods, different HTTP verbs every time, and you'll get a different outcome from hitting that same route every time using different verbs. So for example, you can hit this URL that I'm using here, /API/gas/delivery with a GET request, and it'll give you one thing, but then if you hit it with a POST, it'll do something completely different. So the API that I built this tool with the particular API in mind was for a car, so I'm talking about things like gas deliveries and things, but I mean the API could be anything that you wanted, so just, yeah, don't be confused if I'm talking about getting gas deliveries and things for your car. So for this particular API, I built 4 different routes, so I have a get, a post, a put, and a delete. So my get request, what that does is it just gets an object back about the information about your car. So I should also point out the whole idea of this tool is that you can see your HTTP request headers and body and potentially modify parts of the body with routes other than the get request as well. Send that modified request off to your API, and then you can see the response that you get back from your API as well. So here we have the name and the description of what this GET request is for, so you can get details about the type of car that you have or the level of gas that you have in your gas tank, and that's going to be a JSON object. So if I click Send API Call, we get this JSON object back again. So this is the HTTP response body that we get back from calling this API route with a get verb. So it gives me the name of the car owner, which is my name, my email address, the make of car that I have, so I have a Mazda 3, I have 70% of gas still in my tank, and I use premium gas. So for the post request, the idea was to create a new gas delivery. So, I mean, it might be different where you live, but here in the Bay Area, we have these little trucks that go around, and you can schedule a gas truck to come to your car and to give you a new delivery of gas, which is pretty handy if you can't get to a gas station at any point. So this was just an example of creating a new gas delivery for your car. So you have these different fields here. You can change them if you want to. Some of them are required. I do have some validations on. So here, these are just using Chrome's own validations because I'm using Google Chrome right now. So validation, just Chrome's own validations for the form fields. So say I wanted to change my email address. If I say jill@programming.com instead of coding.com, my name is Jill Robinson. My cell number is 1234567, and I want to schedule a new delivery for tomorrow, the 7th of June. So I send this API call off. Sorry, I have to put the dashes in. That's what the problem is. Okay, so once I get the right format for the cell number, I can't even remember what my own validations are. Okay, so you can see this response that comes back again. So it's updated my email address. I have the same information about owner name, car make, and car gas level and things. And then I've also scheduled this delivery as well for tomorrow, the 7th of June. So for the put request that I have for the put route, this is to update an existing gas delivery. So if I do the same thing again, if I say just change my email address back again, just to show that it all works properly, cell number, and say I want to change my new delivery from the 7th of June to the 9th of June. Send the API call, and then you can see it's updated the delivery for the gas truck to come to your car. And then finally, I have a delete route, which lets me delete, cancel an existing gas delivery. So again, jill@coding.com. These fields are required just so that it would, in theory, know which customer it is that's making the request. Obviously, this is my tool. I'm the only one who uses it. But if you had a company that was using something like this, then you would obviously have lots of different customers stored in a database of some kind, and then the delete route would hit the database to delete the gas delivery for that particular customer. So you need these credentials just so you know who you're looking up. So send API call, you get the request back, and see you no longer have a next delivery field in your JSON object that you receive back. Okay, so in terms of the code, this was built in React, as I said, and also has Node on the back end. And we're using Node to kind of mock up the API data that you receive back again. Normally you would probably receive data like this from a database, as I said, but in this case, as I said, it's only me who's built it, so we don't need a database for one user. We've just mocked up the data ourselves. Okay, so if we look at the code, I was just going to run through a few of the config files first of all before we look at the actual code. When you're dealing with React, you tend to have quite a few different config files that you need to set everything up, because React is kind of built in ES6 syntax, which is the slightly newer form of JavaScript that some browsers maybe don't support as fully as ES5, which is the older syntax of JavaScript. So you have to use things like Babel and Webpack to kind of compile your code down from ES6 to ES5, and then you can bundle it all and package it up and minify it so that your browser can read it. So you use things like Babel and Webpack for that. So first of all, I have my package.json file. So this is from npm installing different modules. So I have React and React DOM. So React is obviously the framework that I'm using. React DOM is what you need to be able to write your React components on the page on the DOM in the browser. And then I'm also using a ton of other things. So I have modules related to Babel or Babel, depending on how you pronounce it. So Babel is what I use to compile the ES6 down to ES5. I'm also using ESLint, which just runs through and lints my code. So it kind of does things like make sure that I'm not using any undeclared variables, or if I'm assigning things twice, if I have the same variable with the same name twice. It also does things like make sure that I'm kind of using formatting rules that I wish to adhere to. So, for example, syntax formatting, like if I look at my ESLint config file, I have things like I prefer to indent with tabs instead of spaces, and double quotation marks instead of single quotes and things like that. So some of it is actual kind of like code functioning, some of it is just kind of syntax formatting. So yeah, I have ESLint as well. I'm also using Gulp, which is a tool that you can use for kind of building your code. So the way that I'm using Gulp is to you kind of, Gulp is like a task manager. You tell it what you want it to do, and you can just type in one command and it can do a load of different things for you. I'll show you the Gulp file in a minute so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm also using Mocha and Chai just for a little bit of testing on my server side to make sure everything's giving me the results that I'm expecting. And then obviously Webpack is for bundling your React code and compiling it all. So I briefly showed you the ESLint config file here. So this is just kind of, to configure ESLint and tell it, that you're using ES6 syntax or that you're using React in particular. And then again, the different kind of syntax formatting that I prefer, so using tabs instead of spaces, or the different style of kind of curly braces that I like to use, making sure that you're kind of not leaving any variables unassigned and things like that. So for configuring Webpack, it's quite a short config file for Webpack. You just kind of tell it the entry point, so where it needs to go in to grab the code from. So in this case, it's index.jsx for me. This is my React code file where Webpack needs to go in and say, okay, I'm pulling this code out, and this is where I need to minify it. So you give it an output and a file name, which in this case is Papyrus API bundle. So this is the name of my bundled code, and you can see it appears here on the side. The code ends up kind of looking a little like this. It's kind of quite long, and there's a lot of different things that I don't really understand because Webpack's done all that for me. And then also I just want to tell it to exclude node modules, because you don't want to compile all of your node modules, just the same as when you say commit your project to GitHub, you don't want to upload all your node modules as well, because those are really kind of, there's a lot of files and they can take up a lot of space, and so you would add those to your git ignore file. It's the same here. You kind of say, I want to exclude these node modules and don't include them in my bundled code. So for Babel, again, Babel is a very short config file. You just tell it that you're using React, ES 2015, and then any plugins that you want it to have, you can include in this array. But you can look up, the Babel config rules yourself and see, what other things you can include in this file. And then finally, Gulp. So I mentioned that I was using Gulp as a kind of task manager. So in this case, you can set up Gulp to do different things. So I have a Gulp task called lint, where if I just want to run my ESLint program on my code, then I can do that and it won't build my code. I also have a Webpack function for Gulp, which it compiles all my code. And then I wanted to make another task, which was called build, which combines the linting and the compilation together in one task. So all I have to do in terminal is just type gulp build, and it lints and compiles all of my code for me. Okay, so that's all of the config stuff. So down to the actual code. Okay, so I have my index.html file. So obviously with React, kind of like with Angular as well, you just have this HTML file as kind of like, a framework where you build upon it. So in Angular, you would have your index.html file, and then you would assign, just like here actually, you would have a div that you used as your kind of container for putting your different partial HTML views into. In terms of React, you just give it a div and then you build your components inside that div. So how React works is it has a virtual DOM. So the DOM is kind of the structure of the page, and what React does is it looks at the HTML div or element that you've given it. So you give it this ID of container somewhere, you tell it, okay, I want you to look at this div and I want you to compare what's already inside that div against what I've told you should be inside that div from the virtual DOM. So it compares the DOM, the existing DOM, against the virtual DOM, and if they don't match up, then it changes the existing DOM to match the virtual DOM. So that's kind of how React builds the page with the components and things in it. And then I've also just put a script tag in here with a link to my bundled code in. So you always link your bundled code. You don't link your normal code. You want everything to be transpiled. You want it to be changed from ES6 to ES5 syntax, and you want it to be kind of minified and bundled up and things. So you always use your bundled code here. And then I've also just got a link to my CSS style sheet as well. So if I go to the next page, index.jsx, this is the file that we told Webpack, I think it was, to look out for. Yeah, I think it was Webpack. So this is the entry point for Webpack to go in and grab your code and then bundle it. So this is the file that actually does the rendering to the DOM. There's not much to it. You just have to import React and React DOM. And then I'm also importing this app component from my other file up here. So all I'm doing here is just rendering to the page using React DOM.render, this app component, and I'm saying get this div container and render app inside this container div. So it's as simple as that to render something to the page. So what I'm rendering is this app component that comes from this app.jsx file. And this is up here, and this is basically my way of rendering each of the API routes on the page. So each one of these rectangles with the get or a post route or whatever inside, these are each of these are an app component. So if we go back to app, I mentioned that I had written my own REST API endpoints myself. So in order to render each of these app components, what I'm doing is mapping over endpoints. So what that means is, if I look at my, I'm importing endpoints up here from this endpoints file. So what these endpoints are is, this is an array of different objects, and each of these objects relates to one of the API routes that I want to list on the page and that I want to be able to hit with my browser. So each of these objects lists all of the details that I need about each route. So for example, this is the GET request. So I have method GET, headers, content type, application JSON. So that just tells it that the HTTP request header that I'm going to be sending is going to be, the content of that is going to be a JSON object. Or sorry, not the headers, the body is going to be a JSON object. And it gives you a description, which we could actually see on the page if we look here, get details about gas level, car type, etc. That's right here, because we're actually looping over each of these keys inside the objects to display the information on the page in each component. And we pass the URL and things as well. In the case of the routes where we're able to change things in the body, so for example the email address or the name or the phone number, the body itself of the HTTP request is again another array with elements, with objects inside as each element. And in the places where we have form fields and we want something like validation on there, we can say, okay, so this is an email address. In this form, we want a minimum of 3 characters and a maximum of 24. If you wanted to go further than that, you could also have something like a regex, where similar to here with the phone number, you have a pattern and you say, okay, I want my phone number to match this pattern of 3 digits, then a dash, and then another 4 digits. You could do the same for an email address. You could say, okay, well, I want my email address to have an @ symbol in the middle of it. It has to have dots in these positions, like periods in these positions. And it has to have this kind of pattern of characters in it. People use regexes for email addresses a lot for validation. And then in places where certain fields are required for form submission, so email is not required, but full name is, so we have required equals true here. So anyway, that's just kind of a brief overview of what this endpoints file is. It's just kind of like describing what each of these API routes is, what the data is that's being sent in the HTTP request as well. And I'll post the link to the GitHub repo as well, so you can look at the code more in depth if you want to. So if you go back to the app component, because endpoints is an array of different objects, we can use map to loop over every single element, every single object which relates to one of the API routes inside that endpoints array. And then from there, we're taking each endpoint and we're returning a new component called API, and we're pulling out the data from that endpoint object. So for example, the HTTP method, the URL, the name, description, etc. And we're putting those as props into this API component. So this is a separate component completely. So whereas index.jsx is rendering app, the app component here, app is using this API component in turn to render basically each of these elements inside the page, inside that div. So if we move on now to the API component itself, again, this is quite a kind of long and slightly complicated bit of code. You can look at it on the GitHub repo yourselves if you want to. Just briefly, this kind of covers how the HTTP HTTP requests are sent off. So we have an object here for form data. So if it's a route where you're sending off updated information such as email address or the gas delivery date, then these things would be saved in form data in this object, and these are saved in the state. So that's kind of like a data persistence thing. You can say, okay, save these in state, and then when I send my HTTP request, I'm also going to send the information from state as well with my request. So I'm sending all of this form data across to update. So onBlur and onClick are to do with things like when you click in the form and you click off again if you've made any changes or not, then you want to track what the changes are that you've made. So if you've started to type in a form field and then you click off it, it will save that information into state, into the form data object. OnClick is for when you submit the form and you want to say, okay, I'm going to send the body as the form data object. So here we have HTTP body is equal to the stringified version of the form data, so turning it into a JSON string. And then we're making a fetch request, which is the actual HTTP request, and we're passing in the URL from the props, which we've set in this component here. So we say, where is it? URL is endpoint.url. So this URL key here is set as this .props.url in whatever this API component is describing. So for whichever route you're hitting, URL will be under this .props.url for that route. So we're saying here, fetch this .props.url, which we've just set, and then when we get the response back, we're going to pass that response into a callback, which is setting the response in state. So again, that's the data persistence, and then that allows you to display it on the page. I have a lot of comments in this code as well. So again, if I'm not describing this very well, which I feel like I'm probably not describing very well, then you can look at the comments yourself and hopefully try and figure out what it is that I'm actually talking about. So then we have our render function, which every component needs a render function. This is telling React and telling React DOM when you render something to the page exactly what the structure of the HTML is that you want to return. So here we have our divs and our h1s and p tags and things. So this is what the render function does. It returns this HTML structure back again to display on the page. So we're kind of looping through each of the headers for the HTTP request and response, basically, and then we're going to be displaying those on the page in different formats. I'm not going to go through all of this code because it is quite kind of hard to explain in detail very well without taking another hour to explain on this video. I feel like it's already probably been dragging on for too long. So yeah, hopefully the comments, if you wanted to look at it, would explain quite well what all of this is doing, but basically it is pulling out all of the HTTP request information and displaying it on the page, and then doing the same for the response when it gets it back here. So API response is set in state, and then there's another component down here that will just display this on the page as a JSON object here. So on the server side, I just have a node server. It's fairly simple. This is where I'm returning the information from for the API. So I have this thing called gas object. So it has my name, my email address, my car type, etc. This is the object that I'm returning when you hit that get route. And this is the object that I'm also modifying every time you hit one of the other routes, like updating the delivery or creating a new one. So I'm saying if we're trying to get just the root route, so the initial page, then I want to send index.html back again. So that's just the main page that you see when you refresh this page. This is what's being sent back again, because you're hitting the slash root route. If I'm trying to send a GET request to API/gas/delivery, then I want to just send this gas object here back again, because I'm mocking this data like it would be coming from a database, but obviously I don't have a database, so I'm just sending this object back like it's come from a database entry. If I'm sending a post request to this route, so app.post, I want to say if any of these different keys in the request body exist, so if someone's updated their email address or their cell number or their name, then I want to set those fields in the gas object that I'm mocking up is equal to whatever is being sent in the request body for that different key, and then eventually send the gas object back again with possibly these modified fields in it. And also for the delivery as well, I'm just making a new key in gas object is equal to the date for the gas delivery. And then that's the same for the put object. I'm just updating whatever fields need to be updated. So again, gas object.next delivery is just being updated with the new date that you're sending in your request body. And the delete is just removing that next delivery key from the gas object. So it's just removing that key from the object completely, and then just sending that object back minus that one key. And then finally, I'm just telling my server to listen on port 6789, which is what I always use for React. So you can see here, I have my server, which is running using nodemon. I'm just running, you just have to do node or nodemon server.js, and it will run your server for you. And then if I want to rebuild things using Webpack and Babel, as I was saying before, you just say gulp build, and it will run through. It will tell you that it's starting to lint your code. It's finished the lint, so everything's passed all of the linting rules that I've set, and it's bundled my code. It tells me what the name of it is, how big it is, how long it took me to bundle the code and everything, and then from there you can refresh the page if you've changed anything in your JavaScript code. You would have to rebuild and then change the page, reload the page, and it should have changed whatever component you changed in your JavaScript code. So finally, I just have a couple of tests on my server. I covered Mocha and child testing in my last video, I think it was. This is just the same kind of tests again. I'm just running through to make sure that my server is returning exactly what I'm expecting it to. So every time it hits each different route, is it returning the right status code? So is it returning a 200 status code for the HTTP request, for the GET routes or the POST routes? And also, is it returning the gas object that I'm expecting it to? Does it have the right keys, such as owner name or car make? Or for the POST request, if I'm creating a new delivery date, does it have this next delivery key in the gas object? So then if you go back to terminal, you can run these tests just by saying npm test. If I just click enter here, it will run through all of these tests, hit those different routes on the API, and it's returning what it's expecting for each one of those routes. So yeah, that's probably a very, very long-winded, maybe slightly boring explanation of my API endpoint tester, but I hope that's kind of helped you to understand what exactly it is that I'm doing and maybe how it's kind of built. This app is actually deployed. I'll put the URL in the description for this video, and I'll also put the URL for the GitHub repo as well. So yeah, I hope you're having a nice day. Thank you if you've managed to listen to the end of this video, and I hope I haven't confused you too much. So thanks for listening.